The ANC's controversial step-aside rule has come back to haunt Mandla Msibi. The newly elected Mpumalanga treasurer has been told that he must step down. National spokesperson for the ANC, Pule Mabe, joining us now in studio for more on this. So, Pule, just 2 days after Mandla Msibi was elected and accepted this position, the ANC is asking him to step aside, given the allegations he faces.
Afternoon, Shahan, and afternoon to your viewers. Of course, even at the time of his election, previously when he served in the Provincial Executive Committee, you would have written a letter to the PEC voluntarily stepping aside. Now that PEC has since been disbanded. It was disbanded before this provincial conference could actually convene. Now that there are these developments that you are now aware of, in acting to preserve that resolution of the African National Congress, the Treasurer General has indeed written to Comrade Mandla, advised the Provincial Secretary as well, Comrade Chirwa, that the step-aside rule has got to be effected and that he remains suspended. Comrade Mandla has accepted this in the telephonic conversation he has had with the Treasurer General this afternoon.
So why was he even up for this position given the serious allegations he faces?
Well, you'd know that branches carry their activities in that way. They nominated branches and all of that. I mean, we would not know who is being nominated up until you get to conference, because these things are ran by normally nominations. It's an independent electoral body that would sit on that, and at the floor of conference, it will then announce that Shahan is qualified for this position with so many votes, and then another person will also say, okay, this one is also qualified, and then they go to voting. Space is even created during that period for an objection, if any, coming from the floor. So now what you can't do is that when you have begun with an electioneering process, you can't stop halfway. You have to conclude the process in its fullness. But what the national officials will be doing, actually, they will process these issues and others and ultimately bring them to the National Executive Committee, because the guidelines we developed last year through a process that was led by the Treasurer General, that document is a living document, meaning that as you move along, you will draw certain experiences, and through those experiences, you will then have to enhance or enrich your very guidelines so that there is consistent application of those guidelines. Because if the application of the guidelines do not become consistent, you can imagine what will happen, especially now in this crazy season where the ANC is sitting many of its regional and provincial conferences.
Is it not a show against the step-aside rule of the ANC when branch members actually decide to elect or even nominate someone who's accused of serious crimes? Because they know the rules. Yes. They know that this is the decision of the ANC.
Well, they know the rules. They know that this is a decision of the ANC. But remember, what has not been clarified, which is the work that we now need to do, is that under conditionalities of stepping aside, we now have to then say, what do this mean if Shahan is to be nominated? Because there are certain privileges that you enjoy as a member. One of the two distinctive ones as it relates to this case is to nominate and be nominated. So you have to make sure that between your constitution and the regulation, the regulatory framework you put up to implement your own resolutions, you create that form of a link. You know, that's very important. But now, branch members of the ANC who come from basic units are now having to interact with this for the very first time. We, the apex leadership of the African National Congress, have to then come back and say the implications of implementing this resolution means this as it relates to Shahan's status to be able to stand or participate in a conference of the ANC as a delegate.
So is the ANC now saying to branches for future conferences that you cannot nominate someone who has stepped aside because of serious challenges that they're facing?
What the ANC needs to do is that when it meets, it must reflect on this and then say, practically, what does this mean? Are you going to elect Shahan only to ask him to stay at home while he has stepped aside? So you have to really tighten the screws as it relates to conditionalities. But this can only come out of a collective consensus established through that meeting of the National Executive Committee. These are developments. is for the first time that since we introduced the guidelines, we are having to deal with a prominent case in this way, where at the provincial level, a cadre has been elected into a position of responsibility, and then we have to clarify what must become his role going forward. We have dealt with issues of this nature in regions, in the past in KwaZulu-Natal, and provinces in certain instances would have wanted to make their own representation. Remember, when you have stepped aside, in the 6 months period that you have stepped aside, there's got to be a review. Because, you know, there's this notion that justice delayed is justice denied. So that you do not find cases that are before the courts taking forever to be resolved, while Shahan is being disenfranchised from participating in the full political life of the African National Congress. And yet they are still legit members of the organization.
Yeah. So, you know, and the reason I'm asking whether there's growing discontent and a smack in the face of the national leadership with branches and regions doing this, because we saw in Newcastle, of course, you had Ntutuko Matlaba, who was found guilty of assault, sentenced to 2 years or a fine, but that still happened. So is this an uprising within the ANC of members who are saying we still don't accept the step-aside rule, which you and I both know is a very contentious issue in the party?
Well, that's why I said I did not want to zoom specifically into Emalahleni. I said in KZN, that's the story I was trying to tell, that you would have had this in the past in KwaZulu-Natal. And there would have been various representations even coming from the province. Because, you see, the ANC has got, the national leadership of the ANC has got a duty to listen. If provinces raise an issue and say there are these other implications that we need to look at in terms of how we are moving, whether it's something that affects their own unity or their ability to function as an organization, we have to pay attention to those. But even as we do that, then say, but we are unable to move out of this resolution. The only platform that can actually release us from this, if we take a different view on this resolution, that must be the decision of conference, because it was conference that took this decision. Remember, when we look at this thing, going into the policy conference, or NGC, and ultimately the national conference, we ought to then say, of the resolutions you actually gave us, the resolutions we left conference with, which ones were easier to implement as it deals with the conduct and standing of our own members? Then where there are issues, we then say, what do we do to reinforce this? Because these resolutions are necessary to drive the renewal of the African National Congress. And you need to solicit buy-in of the rest of your members on that one. Ordinary members at branch level, those that lead our regions and even in provinces, ought to be the one that embrace all of this. Where they've got views, they've got to use structures of the ANC to deposit their own views with a view of trying to enrich that and making it easier for the national leadership to implement and stay loyal to resolutions of conference.
Is this taking you back in any way for your renewal project? Because you were trying to clean up your image in a very aggressive way since 2020 when you and I had that interview.
Yes.
And now you have things like this happening where branches are basically giving you the middle finger by doing things like this.
Well, I don't think it's a pushback. And we must comment, Comrade Mandla, the fact that he took it up upon himself, even in the initial stage, to step aside. He was never pushed. Even now, as he had the conversation with the Treasurer General, he still acceded to that. Because he says, okay, this allows me space. And because then stepping aside,
I'm not sure why you're congratulating him, because when he was nominated, he should have said, no, actually, I don't want to do this
but remember that he was not in conference. We are getting this, and the cadre is not in conference. We proceed, elections are concluded and is announced. You see, you ought to give credit to comrades of the ANC who do not force the leadership of the movement to apply pressure, temporary suspension, and all measures for them to be able to submit to decisions of the organization. Comrade Mandla, willingly out of his own accord, wrote to the organization and said, while I'm facing these charges and going to my court cases, I want to one step down as a member of the, because he was in an MEC, he stepped down as MEC, and then he also resigned from his position as a member of the Provincial Executive Committee. So now, exemplary in the sense that the expectation is that we want our members to act in a manner that makes it easier, seamless to implement resolutions and decisions of the African National Congress.
So one of your other members should be doing the exact same thing, but hasn't just yet, and that's Dlamini. There are many people saying that she should actually step aside given her perjury conviction and now the fine which she's paying. And one political analyst is saying that it should have happened a long time ago. So we'll listen to that and I'll get reaction from you.
Unfortunately, Mayor Dlamini should have been suspended a long time ago or step aside. But I predict that there will be a call made for her to voluntarily step aside because she has been found guilty in a court of law, even if there had been an option of a fine. It has reputational damages for the African National Congress.
So, is she going to step aside? Are you going to ask her to step aside given the conviction and sentencing?
Well, there is a process already that is being undertaken by our national officials. When you go into a meeting of the ANC and you arrive at a certain, you make a certain determinations. Now, the conclusion you have arrived at here was that national officials must engage with Comrade Batabi. National officials are assist with that task. It would be unfair in the middle of that, outside the meeting, come to eNCA, announce a big decision when people are still yet to meet. You know, we trust the ability of our national officials to be able to implement decisions of the NEC in a very consistent manner. They will come back and brief us once that meeting has taken place, and they will also advise us on what are the next steps.
Was she not meeting them today?
I would not be aware of when they were meeting, but the decision that they must meet is there. We have communicated it out in the public. I might not know whether that meeting is happening today, tomorrow, or Wednesday, or any other day. I will only know when we go to the National Working Committee.
Okay, now this is where there are inconsistencies in what you're saying, Pule, because you're telling me that the ANC has processes in place and it acts swiftly when it comes to things. You gave us this 4-page statement today. Actually, it's longer than 4 pages, a couple pages, reminding us about the step-aside rule.
But I didn't give you that. I don't know where you get that from.
Well, it was sent to us.
Okay, that's
right.
Fine.
And this happened 2 days after Msibi was elected as the provincial treasurer in Mpumalanga. Dlamini was convicted 2 weeks ago. She was then sentenced last week. So this is 2 weeks in the making, and you have not made a decision about Dlamini. Why are things slower when it comes to her versus Msibi?
Well, I wouldn't even want us to get into the terrain. You see, because once we start getting into that mode of comparing cases in that way, we might lose it along the way. There is a process that our national officials are leading. I'm going to request that we allow them to lead the process. And once that process is concluded, the ANC will be able to pronounce itself well within its own policies.
So there's no special treatment for
No, we don't.
Because your pace at which you're working on Msibi versus Dlamini are two separate paces.
Well, I don't think so. It's just that.
No, it's fact.
Well, you see. Here is a topical issue. We just came out of the provincial conference of the ANC in Mpumalanga. One of the person that is elected into a position of responsibility is someone who has been criminally charged. So now it is bound to attract attention in that way.
Okay.
But again, Comrade Mandla had already written to the previous PEC where he served. So what you were doing now was just to make sure that you still assert and affirm the decision that was previously taken. You know, so when you ask me that I've got this information before me, I don't say to you, I don't know, because as I was coming here, already this question was coming up. And I had to call the Treasurer General, solicit his view and establish if this is a fact. He has since confirmed that it's factual. So the letter has been written, that conversation has taken place, Comrade Mandla has acceded.
Okay.
That meeting with Comrade Bata will also take place. Officials will come back and report.
Okay, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it. The ANC's national spokesperson, Pule Mabe.